All right, guys, last video for the week. I'm going to give you tomorrow for basically just some reflection. I'll ask a couple of questions maybe to get you thinking about the week and the information we've gone over, whether you're more or less comfortable with the just war theory than you were to begin with, or if your thinking has begun to develop at all. But that'll be for tomorrow. Today's video will basically be, as you can see on your screen here, criticisms and limitations of the just war theory. It's a pattern we'll follow next week as well as we talk about pacifism, which won't take us nearly as long, I think. Um, but we'll talk about pacifism and then we'll do criticisms and limitations of pacifism, and you'll have sort of both sides of the coin to consider. One thing that I do want to make sure that I'm making pretty clear is that there are really tight parameters on Christian views of war. There are certainly people out there who would say, listen, all is fair in love and war, all is fair in war, you got to win above all else. I don't know that you could actually harmonize that with a view, a biblical view of the way things should work, a Christian view. So we do have these hard edges, and on one end is the idea where we can't just let go and say whatever happens happens. Winning matters more than anything. We've got to hold a line. On the other end of the spectrum with pacifism, I think there's another line which says there might be a temptation in pacifism, which is, merely an isolationism, cutting yourself off from the problems of the world, letting the world burn while we, have a safe community of our own. And I don't think that would be Christian in any way either. So there are edges, and we want to hold them as strongly as we can, because obviously the slope is sort of slippery on both sides of it. Anyway, just to do a brief treatment of criticisms and limitations, let's jump in here and remember that with the just war theory, the idea is not necessarily to justify war. A Christian who's a just war theorist doesn't celebrate war, doesn't think of war as itself a good thing. They're not saying, that war is a unqualified good, but what they're saying is that war may be necessary in order to limit evil. We have to make that distinction so that we can continue to hold the line. But one thing that people often say about the just war theory is that it's overly optimistic. Essentially, people like Aquinas, for instance, would on the one hand argue that human beings are flawed, that war itself is a terrible thing, but then on the other hand say, well, human beings will be able to do the right thing within war. That seems overly optimistic. It's in tension with itself to say human beings have flaws, war is itself flawed, but human beings in war will be able to do what is right because they know what is right. That is often pointed out as being overly optimistic. The second thing that people criticize just war theory for is that it's sort of easily manipulated. It could be co-opted with almost no effort to really cover up for an unjust set of intentions. It may be that a government uses the just war theory as a shield for their true intentions. I think if you looked closely at World War I, you could see some of the verbiage betraying this sort of problem in the days and months leading up to the war. There's this idea that it's about justice, but I think if you look between the lines and see some of the cultural machinations in the years leading up to the war, you notice people were just itching for a war for nationalistic reasons, for militaristic reasons, and so they just used the idea of justice as this sort of Trojan horse to get their true intentions onto the battlefield. And that's not hard to do. You might actually find moments where, in retrospect, it seemed like that might have happened for the United States. The second Iraq War, where we invaded Iraq, we said we had solid evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction. It turns out we haven't found any. Now, there might be some alternative explanation for that. Maybe the weapons were hidden, but it's also possible that we had different intentions than what was stated publicly. Our intention of justice was certainly put on display. The idea of Saddam Hussein having illegal weapons and weapons of mass destruction was a security concern, but perhaps it was a sort of trumped up reason for going to war, and maybe we had other reasons. Thirdly, is that it's actually increasingly difficult, you might say impossible, to differentiate between combatants and non combatants, not just in terms of the way war is fought, sort of street to street, house to house is kind of um, typical, I would say, these days. You don't have pitched battles out in the middle of a field somewhere, but the war is taking place in the midst of civilization. But beyond that, there's also modern weaponry that has such capacity that we might say the blast range is too big. It goes beyond simply the military target and starts to include civilian targets nearby. And so a lot of people say, listen, the just war theory was tenable, was possible as a workable theory in the 1100s, in the 1200s, when you attacked a castle or a city that was fortified, and people who didn't want to be a part of the battle could, make their ways elsewhere, or where battles were happening out on a field somewhere. If you think of maybe like the Hundred Years' War between France and England, where battles were just sort of, at chosen locations. A person chooses where they think the battle best suits their, numbers and their weaponry, and they set up camp. It doesn't happen that way anymore, and a lot of people criticize just war theory for that reason. Just two more. This fourth one is that it's really difficult to know with any degree of certainty whether a war is entered into with truly just causes. For instance, think of how difficult it would be to know that you've exhausted all of your peacemaking overtures before the war actually begins. How would you know for certain that the next overture wouldn't work? Another one that comes to mind in World War One is easily criticized because they rushed into war when very easy diplomatic options were available to them. Then beyond just knowing for sure that your causes were just going into the war is this question of whether you'll be able to hold the line once the war begins. Lastly, and this is probably the one that is most transitional for us to pacifism, is this idea of transformation. Remember, for us, with our desire to take Scripture as seriously as possible and the teachings of Jesus as formative as possible, we notice this pattern of Jesus acting and teaching what is transformational. He lives it out and he teaches it. And many people who are Christians who want to criticize the just war theory will say, listen, war might stop evil for a moment. It might actually stop the evil person for a time, but it doesn't transform anything. That actually it's cyclical. That you can see in every war roots in past wars. That no transformation is brought about. You can see that pattern pretty easily during the 20th century. But that 20th century wars that are most famous, World War II, having its roots in World War I, well, that pattern reaches back into the 19th century because World War I has its roots in the Franco-Prussian War, which has its roots in wars prior, dating all the way back into the times of Charlemagne. And you could even trace this pattern from World War II to World War I to Franco-Prussian War, all the way back to the ancient Roman Empire if you wanted to. And so a person who's critical of the just war theory would say, simply put, war doesn't actually break the cycle of violence. It only pushes the pause button for maybe not even a generation. The people who were soldiers of World War I were officers in World War II. And that's one of the main criticisms of just war theory, is that it doesn't actually bring a change to a situation. It just postpones it. And so, if there were other options available that might be more transformative, certainly a Christian would want to entertain those options and to think long and hard about them. So we'll look at the other side of the coin next week, and we'll see if there are really other options that are possible and available to the Christian.